Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Dequanon, Weraton, welcome everyone. I am Professor Ghada Sfeir, the organizer and moderator of this symposium. I am delighted to have you back for the second roundtable symposium on whether cosmopolitanism for Canada's growing diversity is a better strategy than multiculturalism. Please note, the symposium will be recorded. The Q&A and the chat features will be activated during the Q&A period, time permitting. I would like to begin by stating the Territorial Acknowledgement Statement. Geogeage, or Montreal, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. We recognize the Ghanaian Gehaga Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. On behalf of the Department of Education at the University of Winnipeg, I acknowledge that the University of Winnipeg is located on ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. These lands are the heartland of the Métis people. The water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. It's truly an honor to have an Indigenous elder from Manitoba among our registrants today. We acknowledge that Manitoba is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I invite you here to reflect on the significance of the Territorial Acknowledgement Statements and the marking of September 30th as the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. Here, I also invite you to reflect on the complexity of the concept of reconciliation and how we should move away from performative reconciliation and progress toward genuine reconciliation. Please allow me a minute to thank our supporters and the distinguished audience and our panelists. I would like to thank the Department of Education of the University of Winnipeg for supporting this event. Great appreciation to Professor Taysir Subhi Yamin, the co-founder of International Center for Innovation in Education, ICIE, and Professor Karen Magro, the editor-in-chief of ICIE's International Journal for Talent Development and Creativity. Professor Yamin and Professor Magro have dedicated a special issue on this national question about cosmopolitanism after attending the first round table symposium. So my co-host will post the call for the proposals in the chat box, and the deadline is December 30th. Also, feel free to contact me if you want a copy of the call for proposals. I appreciate the support of the Montreal Council of Women and the Community Knowledge Exchange. A shout out to Professor Lorraine O'Donnell, who is the Research Associate of Questcrin. Among our registrants are federal and provincial government representatives, including representatives of the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. Thank you for your interest in listening to our voices. Highly appreciated. We are also pleased to see a large number of professors from various universities across Canada and beyond, including Emeritus Professor Bourès from UQAM, and Professor Alex Adrian, the President of Quebec Board of Black Educators, and many other leaders of community groups and organizations. Thank you all for being here. The participation of this prominent and diverse audience, including our well-informed students, is absolutely crucial to further discuss this national question, hoping to reach altogether an academic conviction to urge the federal government and the Canadian Council of Ministers of Education to put this complex concept of cosmopolitanism on their agenda for further inclusive negotiations. Allow me to announce that we will be expanding this roundtable with a different title though. Our next meeting will be scheduled in November with Professor Lloyd Cornelson, the Active Executive Director of the Global College of the University of Winnipeg, and Professor Geraldine Balzer, the Department Head of the Educational Foundations and Associate Professor of Curriculum Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you, Professor Cornelson and Professor Balzer, for accepting the invitation. Other keynote speakers will be announced later. On April 30th, we have opened up the discussion on whether cosmopolitanism for Canada's growing diversity is a better strategy than multiculturalism. Today, we continue to discuss this question and negotiate its merits in terms of desirability and feasibility in our Canadian society. Here, I would like to reiterate that in 1988, Canada was internationally acclaimed and made history as the first country in the world to officially adopt the Multiculturalism Act. It is the success of multiculturalism in Canada, despite its shortcomings, that paved the way for the possibility to shift to negotiate cosmopolitanism, that concept that posits equal moral worth of every human being, regardless of categories of difference. As Professor Ghosh stated, quote, cosmopolitanism is a broadened concept of multiculturalism, unquote. Please note that from the outset, we are sitting on a unique round table based on equity, diversity, and inclusivity to negotiate this concept and develop a well-conceived definition of it that does not turn out to be another imperialistic project in disguise, as Professor Day cautioned us last time. And Mr. Piciolac-Pfeiffer was skeptical about both concepts by asking, what has multiculturalism done to Indigenous people? Mr. Burke pointed out to the challenges that cosmopolitanism will face in the context of Quebec with Bill 21, Bill 40, and now Bill 96. My apologies. This roundtable negotiation is a sustained commitment to uphold the principles of human rights and social and global justice for everyone in Canada and beyond. Now, I am honored to present our impressive panelists. You are already familiar with their illustrious achievements and awards. I will proceed by presenting our panelists first, and then I invite them to share their insights. I would like to start by welcoming our new panelist, who is joining us from New Zealand, Mr. Luke Samich. Mr. Samich is currently leader at learning or principal at Ormiston Junior College. He has been a principal for 3 schools over the last 24 years. Welcome, Mr. Samich. Professor George Sefade is a professor of social justice, education, and director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto. Nana is his traditional chief's name in Ghana. Professor Ratna Ghosh is Distinguished James McGill Professor and MacDonald Professor of Education at McGill University, Montreal. She is Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Mr. Noel Burke is a member of the Ministers' Advisory Board on Education, on English Education in Quebec. Mr. Burke combines a rich background in management, leadership, and teaching. I would like to note that Mr. Piciolac-Pfeiffer could not join us today because he had to fly to Alberta due to a family emergency. We hope all is well with him and his family. Welcome, everyone. Due to a time constraint, I won't summarize the previous presentations as I have circulated the recording. And without further ado, Nana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ghada. Do I have permission to share my PowerPoint?
Yes, you should be able to share.
Just trying to
Bottom right, the little screen symbol.
I'm looking for.
Yes, next down.
Okay.
At the bottom where you see the volume 68 is the icon before it.
Let me see. Okay.
Okay.
Are we on?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I just had this slide to just show what I want to talk about and that. But let me begin by acknowledging, as Ghada did, the land and the importance and significance of the land. But for me in particular, I think the teachings, what I've been taught by the close connection and knowledge of that awareness of the land is something that always sits with me, and I want to bring it to this conversation. So the earthly teachings and our responsibilities to create the communities we want. So the question becomes, what communities we want and how are we willing to fight for these communities? But I also want to welcome the elders and the ancestors to join us in this room and in the conversation, and to guide us in their wisdom and help us work through some of these issues that we are all dealing with. It's also a privilege to be in a room with colleagues who I respect, Ratna, Luke, Noel, and of course, Ghada. You know, in Africa, currently I'm in Ghana, and I know the internet connection has been very, very poor, but hopefully today is going to be a bit better. It is said when the student is ready, the teacher will always be there. But I see a counter reading in North America from my experience, when one can say in North America, when the teacher is ready, the students will come. Right? And I think these two statements make a difference. But it makes a difference in terms of how we see our role and responsibilities as people who are trying to create communities, working communities. Right? And it's very important that in this desire to create communities, we don't sweep our differences under the carpet, that we come very, very clear and speak on these differences. And I think, to me, given my area of interest in terms of my scholarship, which deals with issues around race, anti-Black racism, anti-racism, right? I'm concerned about some of the current mobilizations around white grievances. And you see that in the restrictive voting rights in the US. Also the extent to which conservatives in Britain misinterpret critiques of white privilege as a reason for the neglect of working class learners, rather than call governments into account for their long-standing education funding cuts. And I think when this is done, what it does is it helps to this divide, the race-class divide. And we see it also in the vicious backlash against race education and the calculated evocation of cancel culture, which in many ways privileges culture wars over the fight for racial justice and equity. I've always wondered, and I think this is something for us to think about, that who would have thought that in a time of a global pandemic, the greatest threat to Western liberal democracies will be perceived as critical race theory. I think in the US context, we see it in terms of the populist rhetoric that has ensured that critical race theory has become a lightning rod for white conservatives in particular to engage in a vicious backlash to anti-racist education, as we see it in Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, Idaho, where people are, or leaders, political leaders, are busy passing bills to prohibit public schools, colleges, and universities from teaching critical race theory. And you ask why. The reason that critical race theory indoctrinates young learners, it poses a threat to the American way of life. It exacerbates and influences divisions rather than create inter-ethnic bridge. Nothing is further from the truth. So a bit about cosmopolitanism and its challenges, right? We all know, and I think, all of us in this room, I think we do write about it. The extent to which cosmopolitanism upholds the philosophical idea that human beings have equal moral and political obligations to each other based on our shared humanity without reference to state citizenship, national identity, religious affiliation, ethnicity, or place of birth. It also promotes the universal ideals and ideas of freedom, liberty, justice, and demand that we question how we can genuinely promote social justice education by engaging in the various debates and contestations around social justice. I think one of the challenges that we have to deal with is how we interrogate how cosmopolitanism has also been part of that imperial and colonial ideologies that have sustained the formation of the modern colonial world. We need to interrogate that and also acknowledge the ways that it sustains this ideology. In particular, and again, this emerges from my own work, where I see the extent to which Western modernity has been marked by a particular race thinking, which only functions to change the rules of reason, standards of logic and rationality. And we see it in white logic, white authority, white control, and white credibility. My urging is that both multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism need to go a step further to center race, anti-Black and anti-different racisms, indigeneity and decolonization in our debates. That is, to situate race and indigeneity as contestations of the cosmopolitanism and the cosmopolitan space, and to claim indigeneity as resistance and decolonization. And I think particularly for this movement, to interrogate how we engage the concept of social justice education in the context of COVID-19. And this is what actually I want to make a departure in my presentation, which followed from last time, focus a bit on the challenges that we presented in this current moment of COVID-19. So anti-colonial reading or framing of social justice education is where I want to start with. I think I call it the diversity, equity, inclusion discourse or rhetoric have increasingly become liberalized. They have also become empty signifiers. Because of a lack of accountability, they have been marked by performances and are pursued as an institutional expectation. I see this from when we were talking about during the George Floyd, where every institution felt the need to issue a solidarity statement. It became a performance. We also see the continued normalization of white and dominant racial frames in schooling that has been damaging to all learners. There's a fixation on an add-on approach where school curriculum remains intact with no disruption of colonial, oppressive, and exclusionary structures of schooling and education. And this is why we need to move beyond that liberal understanding of inclusion and to begin anew. How do we create new communities? What communities are we willing to fight for and to have? And we do this through abolitionist politics to some extent. I think global leadership and educational standards and resources must address systemic issues of power, whiteness, and white supremacy. We must empower our learners to confront anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, etc., and the educational violence that have resulted from erasures, omissions, and negations. And we can do this by centering all learners and their experiences, their cultural histories and knowledges, including building strong family and community partnerships with schools as way of meaningful power sharing. In other words, social justice education must embrace decolonization, indigeneity, land and its ethnic teachings, and disrupt and dismantle colonial structures of schooling, including its colonial hierarchies. All what I'm getting to is education must be for true human liberation. I think in part of this urging is a need for us to deconstruct the normal, who is and who constructs this new norm. To be critical of the normal for its take on oppression and exclusion, whether it's race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, etc. There are also implications for some of us developing this skepticism of a supposedly new normal, because the long-standing issues of race or racial, gender, class, sexual, and indigenous inequities still persist and are only exacerbated by emerging challenges in the new normal. It is those in power who evoke the new normal, as if that normal was not in contention in the first place. So one can ask, is anti-Black and anti-indigenous racism normal? Was white supremacy normal? Were the pervasive surveillances and policing of Black, indigenous, and racialized people normal? We all know that COVID-19 has eyes, and it has seized on existing social inequities which have been drawn around race, gender, class, sexuality, and so forth in the construction of the normal/new normal. So what can we learn in terms of engaging these concerns at the time of COVID-19, when much of teaching is happening online? And that's where teaching online from an anti-racist, indigenous, anti-colonial perspective becomes very, very important. Because we know that COVID-19 has added to schooling challenges in a climate of reduced resources, inequities in online technology, shifts in schooling demographics, and the urgency of central questions of race, equity, and justice that I've spoken about. We also see the reduced access to material resources and inadequate academic support that have impacted student outcomes. This is likely to create even wider achievement gaps between children from lower and higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Also, distinctions based on those who are coming from high income learning pots are people like Bas Karimauchi and Afonso write about. We also see from teaching online the challenge of increased absenteeism from online classes with no conscious or strategic effort to offset such absences. There's a potential of increased failure rates because of lack of personalized lessons to meet learning needs. And this could lead to further pathologizing Black, African, indigenous, and racialized students. There are also the greater mental health concerns. For example, how anti-Black racism has become an additional mental stressor on top of social distancing and COVID-19. The physical and mental health stress of learning to navigate technology and stay focused and attached to a screen. Continuing emotional trauma of isolation, a feeling of deprivation and inadequacy. In other words, how do we engage learners online? How do we assess learners' self-directed learning? Because that's a lot of action of any child. Planning virtual learning haphazardly brings intense burden on parents. Students whose parents are in precarious jobs or essential workers, as we know. They are at risk and their parents likely working overtime. We also know that most of our teachers are largely occupied with learning how to use these technologies like Zoom, Google Classroom, Brightspace. They are putting a lot of effort and energies in learning how to navigate online course delivery. And for some, they are ill-equipped to handle class size, learning levels in mixed classes. And there's a historic problem of lack of curricular sophistication and current culturally relevant pedagogy for deeper student engagement and learning, which can be compounded by an online learning platform. For example, some resources in our learning modules are outdated and are based on white hegemonic content. Who benefits and who may be excluded from teaching online? It's a question to ask. And this means that we see race in online teaching and also see online teaching in race, as others have spoken about. Online teaching practices continue to center and anticipate white learners, white experiences, and white epistemologies. I'm talking of the ontological whiteness of how we come to understand what constitutes success in schooling. Whose voices matter? Voices of the dominant parents are usually heard the most. Black and indigenous racialized exclusions are also something that we have to think about in terms of ongoing lack of access to technology. Schools don't guarantee the provision of electronic devices like Wi-Fi access incapability, even though, for example, in Toronto, as Robin Maynard writes about in Toronto, 2012 data from the Toronto District School Board found that 48% of Black children live in families with income of less than $30,000 a year, compared to 9% of white children. This is a rate 5 times higher that we need to be concerned with. Even government funding through such programs like the Ontario Support for Learners program, that offers a one-time payment of $200 for students under the age of 18 and $250 for students over the age of 18 with disability may not be enough. Within the Toronto District School Board, schools within the highest learning opportunities index have access to grocery cards, extra support for families through designated community support worker programs. This is helpful, but it needs to be expanded to other school board jurisdictions with greater concentration of Black, indigenous, racialized, and working class background students. So to conclude, going forward, recommendations to resolve some of these educational challenges. We all know that COVID-19 has compounded the problem of racism and educational inequities. The pandemic should compel action to reimagine schooling and education, for us to re-examine our institutional policies, programs, and practices that have sustained the untenable educational, health, and social systems for Black, indigenous, and racialized peoples, as Carl James writes about. We also need to examine new modalities and methodologies of teaching. Example, educators, as part of their regular practice, must look for equity-based patterns in our work and use this information for reflecting and adapting our teaching and curricular practices. We must address the contraction of the school curriculum in terms of both the breadth and depth, as well as of teaching styles, because this limits teachers' ability to do a couple of things. One, to attend to and support students in a one-on-one or small group sessions. And two, to incorporate anti-racist and anti-colonial approaches and materials. In other words, we must think seriously about making online teaching more humane and address the access equity issues in technology at local, national, regional, and sectoral levels to address some of these challenges of online teaching. Providing resources to achieve socially just teaching and learning online, responding to also the rising online digital hate. Online learning platforms, example, resources in learning models must be revised to include non-white and non-hegemonic content. And we need to engage in multiple strategies for assessing students during online teaching with its different modalities. There's the importance of dealing with the still rigid, Eurocentered evaluation methods to consider orality as equal medium to written text, giving students the opportunity to submit assignments orally. Not limiting the text to only academic projects, but also include community-based events, such as that would be sites of learning. So for example, students will be given opportunities to attend community events or participate in organizing an event and have access to other teachers and then write or present reflections on their experiences. And encouraging our students to present non-traditional papers, art-based multimedia, as well as other opportunities to be creative and to think outside the box, which will be a recognition and honor of multiple ways of knowing and being. And finally, I think we need to refuse coloniality. And to me, refusing coloniality is to ask the question, what is education for? What schools do we want and are willing to fight for? And in this refusing of coloniality, I think we need to think of a new grammar, or a grammar of new Black, Indigenous, and racialized futurity, as others like Kant and Susie Quanquin speak about, which is to reclaim the past for its lessons, to reflect on the present, and to project onto the future with a sense of hope and possibilities. In other words, to think about the possibility of another possible. Thank you, Asante Sana.
Thank you, Professor Day. That was awesome. You captured a lot of controversies around those topics. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation, but you're not going to be able to take it all in. We need to re-listen. It's dense with information, with the challenges. Thank you very much for putting that together. Thank you. I would like to invite our next speaker, Professor Ghosh.
Thank you very much, Ghada, for inviting me to do this again. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with so many distinguished colleagues. I will begin with acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. In part one of the symposium, I focused on two concepts which were in the title, which is multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. And I suggested that rather than being antithetical, they are complementary, as Ghada pointed out. Both the concepts are worldviews developed over a period of time in school and in society. But in Canada, this move from an assimilationist model to a multicultural model is a paradigm shift, because they are opposed, totally opposed, two sides of the pole, assimilation and multiculturalism. But what I'm saying here is that once we move to multiculturalism, that paradigm shift is a prerequisite to cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolitanism, as you mentioned, is a broadened concept of multiculturalism. Now, cosmopolitanism is a controversial concept, and several philosophers have debated it. Because embracing the world with equity and impartiality across boundaries of nationality and differences in race, religion, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., involves a moral and ethical position. In her book, The Cosmopolitan Tradition, one of the world's most influential philosophers currently, Martha Nussbaum, urges us to focus on the humanity we share rather than all that divides us. Kwame Anthony Appiah, professor of philosophy at Princeton, in his well-known book, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, explains the concept as universality plus difference. He takes three ideas from Diogenes 4 centuries ago, to whom the concept is attributed in Western philosophy. And he says, to be a cosmopolitan person, we do not need a single government for the world, but we must care for our fellow citizens in our societies and throughout the world. And we gain much from dialogue with others across all differences. Cosmopolitan is about listening as well as talking. It's about learning as well as teaching. And universality here means a universal concern for other human beings, learning about other ways of life through different subjects, topics, and media. In essence, universality means believing in human rights and feeling an obligation to see that all human beings get what they are entitled to. Appiah argues that objections to cosmopolitanism means denying the validity of universality and denying the legitimacy of difference. Cosmopolitans accept that many values are worth having and different societies should embody different ways of living. Not all people should be the same. Not all beliefs should be the same as the fundamentalists would have it. Used by a variety of religious and political groups, the concept of unity and diversity, that is unity without uniformity and diversity without fragmentation, shifts the focus from mere tolerance of differences towards a more complex understanding that differences enrich human interactions. This has been used by various religions, but particularly Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, which involve compassion and understanding to protect and live in harmony with all people, animals, plants, and minerals. So this has been used by several people all over the world, the idea of unity and diversity. Excuse me. I would go further to say that, further than Appiah, to say that denial of difference as legitimate is at the root of problems in the world. For example, take colonialism and slavery. The classification of the human race based on difference as deficiency led to social construction of who is civilized and who is not, the uncivilized. All this was to legitimize colonialism, slavery, genocide, and more recently, territorial occupations. Now, we are facing several violent global challenges. The recent crisis in Afghanistan is telling us clearly What happens when there is focus only on power and not on compassion and care? Climate change is showing us every day the dangers to our very survival. The pandemic has dramatically told us, it has never been clearer. We are all global citizens. We need to fight together for survival against a common invisible enemy. Yet in individualistic cultures, social cohesion becomes problematic, as we have seen. We need global-minded citizens because social cohesion will keep us safe and strong as a group. We can't say that I'm not going to do this because it's my right, because your right stops where my right begins. And we need to remember that. We cannot now think in terms of our cities only, or our countries and ourselves first. Canada has a history of violence by colonial settlers. Yesterday was National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. Earlier this year, Canadians were shocked at the discovery of unmarked grave sites of hundreds believed to be mainly Indigenous children near former residential schools. And the Indigenous population is now a small percentage of our country of immigrants. The international migration of people from all over the world have made Canada's population super diverse. It is a very complex form of diversity. One important response has been to advocate fostering a multicultural spirit among people who are different from each other in multiple ways. Globalization, however, has made cosmopolitanism a necessity due to the increased interconnectivity of people from disparate nations. We have to deal with the world. We have to trade with the world. We are seeing media from the world, from all over the world. Contemporary transnational phenomena such as national disasters, terrorism, massive displacement of people, rising inequalities, all these require coordinated efforts for peaceful resolutions. And I'm reminded here of a saying by Gandhi, an eye for an eye only makes the whole world blind. Youth must be remembered, must be empowered. Youth must be empowered to be resilient and think globally for survival of the planet. Global citizenship education has a significant role in developing ethical and critical global-minded citizens who work towards peace, social cohesion, and sustainable development in an interdependent world. Cosmopolitanism does not exclude citizenship in one's country. It simply means we rethink the concept of citizenship through a cosmopolitan lens and as a global field of negotiated practices. Simplistic and single-leveled approaches to citizenship are giving way to multidimensional approaches, reflecting the complexities involved in activities at the local, right from the local to the global levels. Reaching across political borders to different people, cultures, religions, implies developing ethical and cosmopolitan values and a level of quote unquote epistemic humility. And I'm quoting Jagan Beglu here. Within the educational system, the concept of global citizenship education is beginning to overshadow programs such as multicultural education, peace education, human rights education, education for sustainable development, and international education, because the idea of global citizenship education involves all of these. At a time when the neoliberal agenda for economic educational competence has picked up great momentum, the need for global-minded citizens had never been more acute in this complex and interdependent world. The major challenge for global citizenship education is connecting the student with the world and its future by transcending individual and group differences, by understanding of the interrelated global historical events that have taken place throughout the world, throughout history, developing an awareness of rising inequalities within countries and among countries, their responsibilities to their local communities. And we see that very much during the pandemic and the distribution of vaccines. But we need to not only have responsibility to our local communities, but also to the world at large. Global citizenship is about a change in the level of consciousness. In education, it is ultimately about a transformational framework to find peaceful means to achieve global social justice for a future world. Now, our curricula talk a lot about Western and European knowledge. And we think of we tend to think of cosmopolitanism as a Western idea, but it is not at all a Western idea. And that is why I want to bring in Gandhi, because Gandhi is known for his peaceful, unconventional, non-violent strategy to bring about independence to India from British colonialism. His concept of satyagraha, which means holding on to the truth by non-violent resistance to evil, colonialism, refusing to submit to the wrong, colonialism, influenced 20th century leaders such as Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. But he's not known for his cosmopolitanism but his ideals of ahimsa, which means nonviolence, as well as satyagraha, truth, and sarvodaya, welfare for all, were influenced by both Eastern and Western scholars and have much relevance to global citizenship education today. Gandhi had an inclusivist vision of the world, one which was composed of many cultures, all interrelated by some common principles, moral principles, each with its profound contribution. He believed that one has to be rooted in one's own culture to understand the other. His intercultural approach was a form of cosmopolitanism that refrains from imposing moralizing on others, but is comfortable with difference, alterity, and otherness. He recognized the interdependence of humanity and the need to identify with the whole of humanity. His significance for global citizenship education is this message of nonviolence, for peaceful development and change, for an ethics of care and moral togetherness in a fractured world. I want to end with a quote from him. "I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any." Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh. That was fascinating. You provided us with an informative kind of overview of the concept of cosmopolitanism, its various nuances and conceptions, as well as the challenges. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mr. Burke to present. Thank you, Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Yana. I'm just going to find the screen here. Good. So I too would begin by acknowledging our presence on the land, in particular of the Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk people of the Six Nations Confederacy on unceded territory. I guess I want to begin by really acknowledging as well the contributions of Dr. Day and Dr. Ghosh to the conversation this afternoon, and in particular, the focus on the need for the transformation or the reformation of educational systems and settings in relation to cosmopolitanism. In the last session, I focused somewhat on the political background in Quebec and some of the contributions to the continuation of colonialism and other forms of discrimination. And I wanted to come to the question, the challenge that Dr. Ghosh just posed, Dr. Day posed, what are schools for? And one would suggest in organized education globally throughout the world that the function of education is the development, the co-development of productive citizens within those societies. But more deeply, though, the purpose of education is to replace a narrow mind with an open one, to expand students and individuals' perception of the world and view of the world. Also recognize the challenge of Dr. Day, and I quote from his earlier presentation, to center all learners and their experiences, cultural histories, and knowledges, including building strong family and community partnerships with schools as ways of meaningful power sharing. So we see a kind of a transition as we had seen in the earlier presentation on cosmopolitanism, from reflection of self to a vision of the collective. We see this pattern as well in the findings of Drs. Day and Ghosh, from multiculturalism to cosmopolitanism, and from national to global citizenship. The challenge before us, I would suggest, is to really look at how we organize and structure the educational experience for students. In the same kind of transitional sense, I suggested last time a parallel between multiculturalism and a multidisciplinary approach to teaching and learning, which at the time in the 60s and 70s was really a competitive learning environment, that students were competing for grades, competing for recognition. The interculturalism which followed chronologically, I would identify as a transitional school organization leading to interdisciplinary study and cooperative learning. So this move away from, desire to move away from competitive to cooperative learning, and a parallel between cosmopolitanism and what is the most recent development in curricular thinking, the notion of transdisciplinary learning and collaborative learning, meaning that different students bring to the table different perspectives and different skills and different talents and different cultures and backgrounds to face the challenges before them. So Dr. Day also mentioned the new normal. We see, as Dr. Ghosh has also mentioned, cosmopolitanism is rapidly evolving within the internet generation, again, because of this interconnectivity. Traditional systems and assumptions have been significantly disrupted by the COVID pandemic. Raised consciousness about global issues is nurturing the seedlings of global citizenship and a global movement towards inclusive learning environments that promote a collective identity. There was an article in the Journal for Talent Development and Creativity that Dr. Ghada had led me to, by Christine Boyko-Head here in Ontario, talking about the notion of minimizing the familiar and maximizing the diverse. This is a really interesting concept, and she talks about 5 contributors to this. emergent pedagogy, identified as the democratization of learning. In other words, learning is not just something that is driven by a person in the front of a group of students, but learning is driven by the collective collaboration of those present. A refocus from curriculum to relationships, transferable and flexible competencies are needed, differentiated learning as learner-centered, and collaborative learning experiences. So I want to go back for a moment and say all of this is well and good. And there is a tendency in governments charged with the development and evolution of curriculum to compartmentalize learning. We see this in a more general sense by having 8 different subjects. I'm talking particularly here at the high school level, 8 different subjects taught by 8 different teachers who don't necessarily, and in fact, don't typically talk to each other about integrating curriculum, even though this is a very desirable and recognizable challenge. But we also see the compartmentalization of individuals by the fact that they are focused on subject-based learning, textbook-based solutions to problems. Again, without even mentioning the fact that many of these texts are colonially based and Eurocentric. So we're really faced with the challenge, and I and Luke Sumich following me will talk about some of the practical possibilities in incorporating cosmopolitan education and experience into the daily experience of students. This is based on the premise that as governments compartmentalize, the typical response is to say, oh, well, we're talking about citizenship and globalization. Let's insert that into the social studies curriculum. And therefore, we create like a new compartment, which from a political sense of point of view says, okay, well, we've addressed the problem, it's there. And people who are really thinking seriously about this would say, well, we need to model those experiences. We need to model community in schools, not just talk about it. And so that has led us to look at the inversion of some of the current practices in school. Teachers are typically, when faced with the challenge of curriculum, typically find projects that meet the objectives of a curricular program. This inversion that we're looking at is look at problems that are real, relevant, and societal, and drive curriculum through those problems rather than picking artificial problems. This is a visual from the Millennium Project, which talks about the 17 challenges for sustainable development around the world. You see them in the outer circle: global ethics, rich-poor gap, peace and conflict, capacity, etc. Around 5 specific global challenges: poverty and hunger, prosperity, peace, partnership, and planet. This is simply just put there as an example of looking at the bigger picture, which is a major foundation for global citizenship, is recognizing global problems. The OECD has conducted a study over the last 10 to 12 years, I believe, referred to as the Innovative Learning Environments Project. And they looked at innovative schools across the globe in more than 30 different countries. And they developed an observation of a set of principles that are common to all of these innovative learning environments, which I would suggest fits beautifully into the notions of cosmopolitanism as a learning experience. Learners at the center, the social nature of learning, emotions being integral to learning, recognizing individual differences, stretching all students, assessment of learning being formative rather than summative, moving away from standardized testing, and building horizontal connections, not only across the subject areas that I had mentioned earlier, that We need to have a holistic view of curriculum, but also a horizontal connection within and without school. So the boundaries and the compartment, the larger compartment that is school, those boundaries become osmotic. In other words, that the community can engage with the school and enter the school, and vice versa. So a cosmopolitan curriculum, I would suggest the model is the Quebec Education Program, which has been celebrating, I think, although I don't hear of any celebrations, 20 years since its beginning in 2001, and remains, according to experts such as Michael Fullen, Pasi Selberg, as one of the premier models of curriculum worldwide. And just a quick overview, the three outcomes of the program are construction of personal identity, construction of a worldview, and student empowerment. You know, I didn't make these up, and Dr. Ghosh and Dr. Day and I didn't have a conversation before today's presentation, but we can see even 20 years ago that there was a strong vision for cosmopolitanism starting to evolve. Even though we have to be honest that the implementation of that curriculum at the secondary level in Quebec has not been the success that was expected and has not been fully implemented. And I'm being polite when I say that. It has been barely implemented along these kinds of lines. It is a socio-constructivist approach to student development, suggesting an inclusive world perspective. So it is really social constructivist in nature, and takes on an interdisciplinary learning approach which promotes holistic and inclusive view of the world. And this is just a model of the curriculum itself. One thing I would like to point out without going into a lot of detail is the attempt to decompartmentalize subject learning. You see in the outer blue band, there are only 5 subject areas. So condensed from what were as many as 19 subject compartments are being suggested to be condensed into 5 subject areas. Driven in the center by and I just give a nod to Dr. Ghosh again, interdisciplinary and interdependent social constructivism, that learning is dependent on the others. This is an example of one of the subject clusters, social sciences. Again, we see that. And again, we would expect now with pressures around anti-racism, etc., to have governments typically focus on this area of study. What's interesting is in the center, if I go back to here, this centerpiece here, we see construction of identity, worldview, and empowerment that I mentioned. Outside of that, the next ring is personal and career planning. And outside the orange ring is a set of cross-curricular competencies and lifelong learning. And you have them here. And the intention of the curriculum design was that all of the subject areas are actually driven through these set of generic competencies, which are not laden with cultural bias, racial bias, etc. That, you know, solving problems is solving problems, not pre-identified. And in fact, in many innovative schools, and we'll see that with Luke Stummitz later, many innovative schools, the students themselves generate the projects and identify the problems to be resolved. And so we've been working on a project in which we saw, you know, we experienced the findings of OECD, a project called Next School here in Quebec. We started a community learning center project about 15 years ago, which now numbers 90 schools. And our current focus in our work, in conjunction with the research team at McGill and the Faculty of Education, looking at, well, it didn't really take hold, the community learning centers at the high school level, just like the Reform didn't. And we identified three systems approach to resolving the structure, because we were and are convinced that the problem with moving to a cosmopolitan education in this case, or school reform in general, is a structural problem. That this organization of as many as 8 subjects with 8 different teachers who don't communicate with each other is really the largest block to moving forward. We talk generally speaking about the temporal domain, the relational domain, and the pedagogical domain. And I wanted to zoom in on this notion here, learning hubs. What we've discovered is that if you take a group of students, and we've observed this in a number of settings, and I'll give you the reference towards the end of the Innovative Learning Environments project of OECD. If you take a group of students, let's say 100 students with 10 teachers, and they become a self-enclosed bubble, if I use a pandemic term, function as a bubble, then all of these teachers only work with these 100 students, and they work together. They develop their own schedules, their own sequence of projects, etc. Amazing things happen, and the replication of a community of equal contributors actually takes place in these settings. Over here in the pedagogical domain, we see a focus on applied learning rather than paper and text learning. And we see in the temporal domain the notion of daily planning by students and teachers. They check in every morning and they talk about what they're going to do for the day, and they work together on all of this, across all of the subjects. And also co-curricular crediting, that students who learn and have experiences outside of school are recognized through credits that are granted in school. We know from solid research that when school values what students learn outside of school, students in turn value their school experience. So just to give you an example of a kind of innovative school schedule, this in part, and I have to salute Luke Summich, that part inspired by their work, we see an adaptive learning framework which has some of the following features. So every morning there's a daily teacher planning session of about a half an hour where they sit and talk about what's going on, what projects they're doing, what work their students are doing, followed by a daily student check-in and plan. And the teachers then, each of the group of students, as few as 10 to 15 students, have a coach mentor. One of the teachers becomes their coach mentor and follows their progress across the curriculum, not just specifically, but also provides the opportunity for students to personalize their learning and share difficulties they have around learning that are not just the classic special education definitions of inability to cope with curriculum demands, but actually to talk about integration issues, interpersonal issues as well. That's followed by, we saw the 5 that have been identified in the Quebec Education Program, a breakdown into 3, and this is quite common in many of the innovative settings, into 3 subject clusters. 1 being literacy and language, 2 being numeracy, including science, math, and technology, and the 3rd that we're identifying in the project as identity. So even moving away from the notion of social studies, the study of social issues, we're talking about identity, personal, group, collective identity. That takes up about 2/3 of a day in this model here, and it's core learning. And the core learning is not geared for the value in itself, as currently is the case in academic settings, but is core learning that is important for applied learning. So projects that students work on need core competencies in mathematics, in science, in language, etc., that they then develop those competencies in order to address problem areas, problem solutions. A couple of should reads that I would suggest. One is the Innovative Learning Environments Project from OECD. This material is downloadable if you register for it. It's a very comprehensive project. There are about actually five publications, beginning with How People Learn, moving on to in the fifth publication, How to Implement Innovation in Schools. But this one in particular, the second publication, is a kind of case study of innovative learning environments around the world that focus on inclusivity and personalized learning and community engagement. Secondly, another study by OECD here in Canada, practices in supporting success for Indigenous students. So moving away from some of the traditional attitudes around engaging with Indigenous culture and engaging Indigenous culture in schools. And I think we see some of that from Luke Sumich as well. So in conclusion, we think that the challenges that we are faced, not only around racism, discrimination, and the challenge to move forward in a cosmopolitan global citizenship at the education level, are faced with structural barriers that, if not adapted or changed or removed, will not be successful over time. We're very convinced of this, that high school education in the traditional senses, which is still the dominant models that are in existence, will inhibit this kind of progress. And so projects like Next School and the work of Luke Sumich and people around the world that are looking at these innovative approaches are tackling the structural format, the assumed structural format of schools as we currently know them. So I thank you, and I've further questions. There's an email there, and I'm sure the documents will be circulated after the session. And also, if you're interested in a very quick overview of Next School, there's a blog at this website here that is, I think, 10 different blogs. They're quite short, but quite concise, talking about the ambitions of Next School as a model for innovative education, not the be-all, end-all answer, but a valiant step forward in addressing the challenge and expectation of global citizenship, which is, from a cosmopolitan point of view, I would suggest inevitable. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Burke. It was informative and interesting, and you brought up so many ideas that very helpful to understand the structure and the curriculum and everything. It's like we have a lot to think about, and the Next School interdependent system for an adaptive learning ecosystem is also amazing. We have among us teachers and in high schools, professors and the CEGEP teachers, and I think that's going to be very, very informative for all of us. Thank you so much. And now, Mr. Sumich, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, can you see that screen clearly?
Yes, we see it clearly. Thank you.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ki te atua, tēnā koe. Kia papatua nuku, tēnā koe. Ki te whare, tēnā koe. Ki te hunga mate, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Kia tātou te hunga ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Podgara Hurwatska, toko whenua. Ko Sirhoi, toko whānau. Ko Tarara, toko iwi no Waiharara ahau. Ko Luke Sumich, toko ingoa.
Because of the unprecedented events, it's clear that this can now only be described as a terrorist attack. You shot 9 times in the outlaw box. Yeah. And there you were, seeing the man. Yeah, I'm strong. I told you. Kiha kaha, what is New Zealand is stay stronger, and we are. Thank you guys. Thank you. I need to go.
I'm not sure how clear that video was, but Tamel was a man who was shot 9 times. Look, the point of this, of showing that video is to start thinking around about cosmopolitanism in terms of a continuum of progression that can be learnt. It can be learnt, modelled and grown. Tamel, at his time of greatest stress, of greatest emotion, of anger, of fear, of leadership, he reached into his heart. He found a global citizen, but someone who found that he could only express himself in words of a language that were foreign to him, but they also belonged to him. He may have been in New Zealand 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years, and he at that time was kia kaha. And I saw this on the news, and he said, a big weight comes off the shoulders. We are sacred, our community is sacred, and our country is sacred. So kia kaha, New Zealand. Who uses the words of the Indigenous people at their most greatest time of stress? And to me, that embodies what global citizenship can be. But it has to start right at the essence of where you come from. And for Tamel, he comes from this country, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and he also has a connection and a belonging to the Māori people just by being here. And it was beautiful. And I just wanted to start with that. Ormiston Junior College, yes, it's multicultural. It's multicultural by name and by nature. There are 800 students, 37 nationalities, 17 sort of ethnic groups that the government might categorise them as. And for just as a context, the grades in New Zealand, the US grades are 6 to 9. In New Zealand, we call them years. It's just before those external exams that students go through. But in designing a new school, we had to start with the relationships. People came from where they came from. And we also had to go, well, where do we come from? Where's this piece of land? And so we started to try and seek relationships with the Indigenous people, with our iwi, as we call them, the people who were specifically from where our school was situated. And so we searched for introductions to relevant people. And when we found those introductions, we looked for connections with those people. Facebook friends, I see you know so-and-so. We listened, we asked for nothing. We took an interest in someone else's stories. We asked permission. We still ask permission, even though we're told, why are you asking? We are a partnership with our iwi, and we especially treasure this. So when we were placing together a new school, and a place where all of these new New Zealanders or old New Zealanders, just New Zealanders are arriving, we had to put together a place where people could immediately join and feel like they belonged. And so we used a narrative of navigation, and we navigated our way to this place. We navigated our way to this school. And so we were actually gifted the names of the buildings, and I don't know how many schools I've been into, and you can walk along and it's the John Ross Memorial Hall or the Simon Bridges Memorial Library. And you start to ask yourself, like who was John or who was Simon? But actually our places are the places that have been gifted to us by the ancestors of the people who were once there. And they're not about their name. They aren't just represented by their name. They're represented by their story, the actions, and the esteem in which they were held. So within our school, children say, oh, I'm going to Manawatiri, and we're meeting in there. Manawatiri was a great chief, and the children know the story of this chief. Now, other parts of New Zealand, they don't know Manawatiri's story, and that's okay, because it's a different section and a different place. But that sense of belonging, we have students from, a boy from Herat in Afghanistan, via Pakistan, via a refugee house, he walks into that school. And then I walk into that school, as you see in that PPH that I gave from Croatia from 100 years ago. I've ended up in this place. We've both navigated our way to Ormiston Junior College, and that bicultural relationship, that connection, that's the foundation for which we start to grow. And it's something to consider when you have a school. You ask those questions: who are we and where are we from? Look, it's just one school's approach, perhaps towards cosmopolitanism, it perhaps towards a global citizen. Like many things in a journey to discovery, we didn't have a secret plan to take over the world. It's a few like-minded people wanting better than what education currently provides. We have, through actions and through mistakes and through failure, moved along the path from competitive education to collaborative education. And it's been done through a collaborative set of values and beliefs about learning. It's been done through a cultural narrative that's inclusive and respectful. It's global, but also quite specific, and it honors everyone's journey to now and into the future. So our biculturalism underpins us, and we cross-check in our minds before we default out to monoculture, and then we look for other perspectives. And this just becomes the norm. I've got to give you this example. It's my mum passed away on Monday, and my brother's a priest. And we were having a discussion about the funeral, and funerals can only be held in small numbers at the moment because of COVID. And he said to me, he said, her spirit is gone, her body's just a vessel, and we can wait a few weeks for the funeral. And that was his spiritual connection. Immediately, I went to the Māori connection. I'm not Māori. I don't speak Te Reo Māori. I don't speak their language. But immediately I went there and I said, no, look, that's your spiritual belief, and that's okay. But in Māori, you don't leave the body, and you don't let them leave its side until you say farewell at the cemetery, and it's done. And so for me personally, a 55-year-old white male Pākehā, I don't know how to describe myself, I defaulted, even at a time of stress, to somebody else's cultural beliefs because of it's a learnt, the bicultural nature is learnable. And I have a huge respect for that. And it's just something that happened on Monday. It's just who we are and the way we've developed. That certainly would never have happened through my upbringing 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So it's a continuum for everybody, and it's learnable. I do want to now just talk about the role of the teacher. And, no longer can you be an 8th grade math teacher or a 9th grade social studies teacher. It just doesn't work anymore.
So what do you think about this school? This school, I really love it because it's a place of where you could take new opportunities and possibly become one of New Zealand's best students, become in a really, really good position, because in our own countries, just poster, whiteboard, teacher says, and then you just do your work. But here, it's more, you're interacting with people more, you're having better opportunities. It's like you're working as an adult, taking a step forward in life, which is what I really like. Do you feel like you're given more power at the school? Because in here, my own country, I would go to school thinking, school is so boring, But here, because teachers are more interactive with students, they're more have more of a smile on their face, interact with their projects, support them. I go to school feeling happy, taking a step forward, more confident in my learning, in my knowledge, in my everything. So I find it a really good thing what teachers do here.
So what we've done is that we've taken a teacher and we've said, hey, this is more than just education as we know it. You really need to be more than just content delivery. So we've called you the Mac. You are their mentor, And while you're their mentor, you're going to have that student for 4 years to look after. You're not going to have them for 40 minutes in one class. You're their significant caring adult. You're charged with their pastoral care, a personal learning advocate for their 4-year journey at the college. And you know, I could talk about examples and samples, but connections with families and being there to give them that long range view of their growth and development is enormously important. And imagining the 10-year-old that walks into the school in your 6th grade and the 15-year-old that leaves in your 9th grade, their needs are hugely different. And that student grows with that teacher. So the mentorship is extremely important. The A in MAC is around advisory, and advisory is not as long-term as mentoring. It's more a 6-month or 1 year. They identify learning gaps. One size fits one for the student. And it's about engaging in opportunities and supporting choices. And sometimes it's perhaps guiding you to go in this direction or face a challenge, but it's through discussion. It's not through everyone in the class is doing this. Now, if you're in a MAC, you'll be with your teacher 1 hour a day, every day. That's it. What part of the curriculum is it? Look, you know what? It's the learning part of the curriculum. And so this is a crucial part that not only are they mentors, but they're also advisors to students. And an hour a day, you know, is a lot of time devoted in terms of learning time. If you wanted to see a school who was desperately wanting to get the exam results, that really mattered. And then if we go to the coach in the last part of the MAC, the mentor, the advisor, and the coach. Look, coaches at halftime might say to you, can you kick the ball down into that corner? But coach, and they want you to do it now. But coaches can also say, where do you see the space? And so it's a little bit about not dictating, but asking questions and making suggestions, and not just in a way that's like, oh, you choose, but in a way that can be warm and demanding. And we know, like, you know, the value between care and expectation, you know, the press that you have with a student, and that schools have the authoritarian relationships. Students do respect authority, but you know what? If the press is high, but the care is low, you're getting nowhere. So it's about finding that sweet spot of high performance relationships. And it's something that is the foundation of where we're at the school. The MAC has to be looking at the unseen as well as the seen. And when we talk about traditional schooling in ways that we, you know, things are visible. Here's the presentation, here's the expected behavior, here's the language, and here's the performance. Now, we all know, we all went to school. We know there are 2 types of behaviors. There's the child in the class with their hand up, sitting there nicely, and when nobody else is looking and there's no teacher in the room. So there's so many underlying factors to a child's success or failure at a school. And it's all of those unseens. And so the powerful nature of MAC. Now, I don't have a MAC. Every other teacher in the school has a MAC. Their kids, I will see a kid in the playground. Who's your MAC? Oh, it's Mr. Strickson. Oh, who's your MAC? Oh, it's Scylla. Who's your MAC? Oh, it's John. And they have this family connection. They're able to talk and discuss and meet. And by the way, their MAC is not all kids of the same age level. You know, what's that about? Why? Where in the world was it ever written that 7-year-olds only work with 7-year-olds and 12-year-olds with 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds? That's a colonial attitude to learning that has no place in our school. This is the relational structure that the school's built on, but there's also a delivery of curriculum, and this is where I wanted to get to. Instead of, we had to define our values and beliefs as staff to get that shared understanding, you know, what transdisciplinary curriculum might look like. We came across this infographic here, which kind of sits quite nicely, you know, talking about disciplinary and multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. I was overlaying this as I thought of this presentation. I was overlaying this in that analogy of the rowboat. You see, you move forward in a rowboat, but you're always glancing ahead to see where you're going, and you take with you the very important things that go with you. So, you know, really important, you know, if you're going to look towards cosmopolitanism, you don't just throw your brought up with your multicultural lens that you have and your bicultural power. You actually take all of those pieces with you, the bits that are extremely relevant. So when we were talking about developing a transdisciplinary curriculum, what does that look like? Well, I tell you what it looks like. It looks like not one subject, but multiple subjects overlaid with relationships, with managing self, with thinking. It's overlaid with a cultural lens. It places learners at the center. It acknowledges the social nature of learning. It acknowledges emotions integral to learning, recognizing individual differences. It's able to stretch all students, not just the ones that are prepared on that day for their learning. It embraces assessment for learning. And look, the paradigm of one is gone. One teacher, one subject, 1 hour, 1 year level, one class. That paradigm, why are we persisting with that paradigm? There's no need to, and we've chased that out the door. What our transdisciplinary education has evolved to is something we call TAPE. And our students just call it TAPE. Yeah, what have we got for TAPE? Oh, we've got this. TAPE stands for Transdisciplinary Authentic Inquiry Projects. Transdisciplinary Authentic Inquiry Projects. Teachers sit around and they say, where's the authenticity in what we're planning here? Now, look, we threw out the subjects, right? They're gone. Yes, we have numeracy and literacy and foundation core work that's essential, but we threw out the subjects and said they're gone. I mean, like Trump could write an essay on racism. You know, he might get a C or a B or a B minus or something, but, you know, do we really want to write the essay on racism, or do we actually want to show and evidence the work that we've done and what we've learned and how we've gone about it and the steps that we've stepped through and how we've helped people and perhaps even unlearn? Now, that would be way more powerful than writing an essay and getting a B minus. So our tapes can be anything that comes up that might lean towards a context. And so you could think STEM with an overlay of a cultural lens, or arts with English and added dispositional attributes. So we're talking multiple teachers, community-based projects, global projects, Indigenous lenses, shared and celebrated. It's real and it's relevant. So during TAPE, or after our learning, our MAC learning or our TAPE learning, all students use, you know, learning journeys. And so learning journeys and narrative assessment, this is a systemic sort of change that I want to get to the next part of what's possible in school learning. So there are learning journeys and there are narrative assessments for learning. I'll try and explain what they look like, because I think this is about examples of possibilities of what cosmopolitanism may look like in a school, and actually it's just what we do. So I'll keep going, and I'm hoping that there's a continuum here.
What is a learning journey? It's something to keep everything in one place to make it easier for both the students and parents. In a learning journey, you reflect on what you planned on doing, what you actually did, and what you would have improved on. Without doing these two things, you couldn't possibly have learned anything. You're meant to reflect on the journey of your learning, because it doesn't matter what the conclusion is. The thing that matters most is the journey that led up to that moment. I think the learning journey is better than an assessment, because it doesn't put people in categories of how well you did. It's a celebration for everyone, because when you look around, everyone deserves to be celebrated. Thank you.
With learning journeys, you are able to show your evidence of what you have learned. Whereas compared to a test, if you don't show up on the day, or you're not performing your best, or you just simply forget, it's automatically like you don't know it or you don't understand the context surrounding your learning. I find that learning journeys give you the opportunity to guide people through that process without just relying on the final result. As much as the final result is important, I find that the process is just as equally important, as it shows your understanding of your learning. Many people do learn differently, and I think that concept is mistaken through final results. So yeah, I think a learning journey is a process that is extremely underestimated and misunderstood, coming from someone that misunderstood it herself.
What I would want out of an assessment, this would be for it to show my progress towards my goals, and I want it to judge me for how hard I work on it. I also want it to highlight my roadblocks and what I did to overcome them, and possibly emphasize my growth throughout the development of what I did. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
The students talking about their learning journeys and them being assessed based on how hard they worked on it, and the journey itself of here's what I went through, these are the steps I went through. Again, you know, an essay on racism, or actually working your way through the steps of that journey. It may not actually be about the topic or the area. It's really about that learning, that the steps of learning. So as well as their learning journeys, students have to pitch for their grades. So they will get together and they will bid for their grade, and they will give their evidence, and they'll show what they did along the way. So I've got just a few slides here of what types of things kids are learning. So if I look on the right hand side, it says whole order 3, the badge criteria: a learner enhances their interactions and relationships with others and takes social actions to contribute to healthy communities and environments. Now, that's really powerful stuff. If I could find a 14-year-old that could do that, I would be extremely proud of them. But it's not, you know, how are you going to do that? Well, there's some criteria below that badge, and children have to talk to that criteria, and we're looking for evidence. They may have photos, they may have videos, and it's discussed in front of their MAC, the other 20 students, 16 students, and they also contribute to somebody else's learning. I'll have another senior, this is another badge. Again, I'm looking on the right-hand side. And I'm just reading the top of it, and it says learner has a range of skills and strategies that can apply them for successful collaboration. When do we ever sit down and talk specifically about collaboration and give kids a step-by-step, here's how we go about it, or how have you gone about it? What are the things that you do? Can you prove and show to me that you're a collaborative student? This is essential stuff if we're talking about success in life and lifelong learning. Another senior badge, I'm looking on the right-hand side. This is 14, 15-year-olds. Learner communicates with empathy and effectively with people from different cultures. Now, there's one piece of the criteria that sits in there that I really love, and it's I recognize that I appreciate that language and culture is used to achieve meaning for people and can use appropriate strategies to support effective communication. That's difficult work. That's hard stuff. And this is the type of work that we're looking at now. I also learning to learn. A learner can think critically to choose appropriate strategies and tools or models to deepen their own learning. We have to actually show them how to learn. This is not built entirely on content. There are content badges, of course, and here's one of them. A learner can demonstrate their scientific knowledge by applying it through a variety of investigations. Now, yeah, I went to science. We've all been there with the beaker and tipped it into the what's name, and we've done something. But were we actually demonstrating scientific knowledge by applying it through a variety of investigations? No, we weren't. We were given one investigation by the science teacher and away we went. So these badges are out and there's a whole pile of them, 20 odd, and there's a bunch of criteria which children have to unpack in their own words. And they unpack this criteria and they put it in front of the other students and they talk to their badge, their evidence, and their assessment is done with others. It's formative and for their learning. And as you heard the girls say earlier, I want to know what I did right and wrong. And so that I can build on it. I'm just going to I've got a couple more slides just on the process of badge bidding, assessment for learning.
For overall skills in different areas of the curriculum, we have our digital badges. Each badge is linked to different criteria, and the criteria come from the New Zealand curriculum. So, for example, we have some badges which are more linked to the performing arts, like badges that are like I can have a multi-literate understanding of the arts, and different badges which require you to work with science, and a badge that requires you to work with experts from outside of school. Yeah, so each badge is linked to a different criteria which assesses us on our skills in that particular area.
And that actually was Priesi pitching for her badge in front of the other students. And you may have seen, you know, one of the boys there on the side talking. This is this girl's assessment. Could you imagine presenting your assessment and someone else's, another student's talking back, and you're thinking, what are you doing? Why have you got to say in my assessment? But they have, because they're also giving feedback or promoting evidence or saying, I saw you did this, or can I clarify? So this is an opportunity to really understand that the student knows and student understands. And this is, I'm not going to say daily practice, but it's weekly practice at our school. One student this week, even through lockdown, even over Zoom, will have been sitting and pitching for their grade, and others would have been listening and contributing. It carries on. So I just, I have a teacher who expresses his feelings on the narrative assessment, and I think it's really relevant. I'd like to share that.
I think my biggest thing is that it's student-centered. It's about relationships. It's about being very clear with what your role is as an adult to support that child, and choice. I love the fact that our students have choice and that they are co-constructing what we're doing. They have support and boundaries, but they have ownership. If someone said to me, what is special about OJC? One, it'll be relationships, and that they're genuine and that they're provided time to grow. Two, I'd say the focus on dispositions, in terms of wanting to not only focus on can you sit an assessment, but actually do you have the attitude towards growth? And the last one would be student agency. Students are given opportunities to drive their learning and to be a part of it, not just as people getting on the bus and getting a ticket, but actually becoming learner drivers. Yeah.
And, you know, we often will say to our staff, you know, you don't just get on the bus, everyone gets on the bus. Sometimes you drive the bus. Sometimes you sit in the back seat of the bus. Sometimes you actually aren't on a bus. You hopped on a plane and you went in that direction. But you know, if we're all going in the same direction with our learning, with our values and beliefs about learning, we can certainly take our students there. So that's a day in the week, a life in the week. I don't know. It's a snapshot of madness and fun as well. Because somewhere along the line, we have to remember we're going to school, you know, it's about learning and a love of learning. And if it's not fun, you won't be loving it. He mihi tēnei kia koutou mō tēnei kōwhiringa. E hia ana ahau kia kimi I tō koutou. Mā tauranga mō tēnei kaupapa kia mau mahara tātou. Iaha te mea nui o te a, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sumich. That was fascinating and impressive. You really delivered your presentation with the warmth of care, and really all of us felt it, and our deepest condolences for the passing of your mother, and great appreciation that you still joined us today to deliver that message of warmth and care. And I think Cosmopolitanism is a winner today. I think I'm looking at all the presentation today from the time we started with the Professor Dave. Throughout all the presentation, the richness of information, the richness of knowledge, the depth of knowledge and argument and insights in it. We really thank God we have a recording. We're gonna listen more than once to the recording to be able to really absorb what you have presented to us. And I have the conviction, I'm reflecting on this richness of knowledge, and I have the conviction that we already established a strong, between last presentation, the first one, and this one, we have established a strong platform to move forward in discussing this concept of cosmopolitanism, and hopefully we'll be able to reach out to our federal government and educational system to address it and put it on their agenda in order to move forward to a better future for our society and for our students. That was really amazing. And we're gonna continue the discussion definitely with various webinars, and hopefully we get in spring, if we're not suffering with COVID, we can have a 2-day symposium in person with all the participants, all the speakers, if they are willing to participate, hopefully to push that cosmopolitan concept forward. It was awesome, fascinating. I'd like to just first, before I start the open up, we have 5 more minutes for questions. Maybe I haven't seen, I think the audience also, did we open the, are the audience able? I'm sending a question to my,
Yes,
the Q&A is open, even though we have a limited time. But at the same time, while we're waiting for a question, I would like, it's an open invitation. If any one of you would like to add any kind of remarks after all these presentations, please jump in, go ahead. So yes, one just came in. When we open the questions at the end of a webinar, it takes people a couple of minutes to type in their questions. And so we have one question from Professor Orlowski. Thank you so much for all presentations. Very interesting. My question is this: in order for a cosmopolitan approach to be successful in schools and in society, must neoliberalism be confronted and dismantled? My sense is that a Green New Deal being implemented would have. Do you agree? Who would like to answer the question?
Okay, I'll say something. I have to think about that, but can you hear me?
I think the audience should be hearing you.
Okay.
Yes, they should be hearing you.
Okay. You know, when we talk of neoliberalism, it depends upon what you mean. If you mean that neoliberalism is running the goals of education, if it's influencing the goals of education to completely focus on working skills, to learn work skills for the future, employment skills, then then if that is the part of neoliberalism that he's talking about, then we have to say that working skills are important, but it doesn't mean, it's not a zero-sum game when you learn values. You learn values in everything. You do not teach values. open-mindedness is a worldview, and the worldview comes through the curriculum. So it should permeate all the subjects and all the areas of learning. And it's something that goes together with other skills, literacy, numeracy, and other skills, organizational skills, everything. It is part of that. So I don't think we should separate them. And neoliberalism in education, there's more, of course, to it. Taking away the public and focusing on the private is a very bad thing for learning values, or for even thinking of anything that is value-based. But I think that we can try to do both. Wherever we are, whatever we are doing, in whichever form we are, the structures, we should be able to think about values and humanistic education, which is what cosmopolitanism is all about.
There is a clarification. Professor Day, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to add something, and that's, to me, I think the challenge is how we build communities of learners, right? And see schooling as community. And to the extent that, for example, neoliberalism doesn't further that project for me, right? Then it needs to be questioned, right? I think, what values are we talking about? Are we talking about values of seeing reciprocity, seeing sharing, seeing mutual interdependence, seeing schooling as community, and creating communities of learners, right? And that, to me, that we deal with these issues around power, right? Power, we deal with these issues around privilege, right? We deal with these issues about who defines what constitutes the curriculum, what voices are missing from the debate of schooling, right? Those are fundamental questions that I think we need to address. And I don't think neoliberalism has gotten us there. I think, if anything at all, it has led to the efficacy of markets, the privatization, and also individualism, which I find very, very troubling with the current system. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Nana. Great question, thank you. And another question by Hela. My question, the one Paul has, I think the audience have seen it. It was a clarification on his question about neoliberalism. I will read the clarification and then I'll go back to Hela. By neoliberalism, I refer to the corporate agenda on schools, human capital theory, as you said, and throughout society, tenets of neoliberalism, deregulation of industry, privatization of the commons, tax cuts, unions, and busting. And I think it was addressed. Hello, my question is, are we ready to shift our focus from multiculturalism to cosmopolitanism when critical multiculturalism is not well established yet? Would like.
Definitely, it's a very important question. We cannot have the liberal version of multiculturalism because it doesn't challenge the power relations in our society. So absolutely, he's absolutely right, whoever wrote the question. It's a very important question because for cosmopolitanism, you need to move a little broader from a critical multicultural perspective, because liberal multiculturalism it's all about song and dance. It's not about challenging privilege. It's not about questioning power relations. It's not about talking about racism and discrimination and things like that, because cosmopolitanism is, you just have to erase the differences, difference as derogatory. We have to erase difference. The meaning of difference should not be deficiency. So you need a critical multicultural education first. And yes, it is not at all established. And that's what we need first. Once we do that, then we move further more than that into cosmopolitanism. I agree with it, with that question.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And thank you for the response, Dr. Ghosh. And definitely in the next symposium or webinars, we're going to provide more practical examples on how cosmopolitanism is going to affect our daily life, is going to affect our access to jobs, our promotions, and so on at this community level, at the city level, at the national level and international level. What do we mean by equal moral worth to every human being? How we're going to do that? We're going to provide more examples, concrete examples of concrete steps, how we're going to be able to do that, to apply it. So I had there was a comment, well said, Dr. Ghosh, about multiculturalism, and to everyone, congratulations, Dr. Sfeir and panelists, a most enlightening event. Hi to all, hi to Dalmatinak from New Zealand to Dalmatinka. So I would like, we ran out of time. Definitely there are more questions in the mind of the audience and everyone else. We will work on that. I'm gonna just throw another question that came, but I don't think you have the time to answer it, which is from Ranjan: how can we transform from multiculturalism to decolonization? So we ran out of time. My apology, Ranjan, but we'll have more. I think if you go back to the, we have responded to the question. Professor Day provided us with in-depth argument that we can find answers for those questions. The recording will be available. I will send it to all the attendees and all the registrants as well. Thank you so much for our panelists, for your generous time with us. Allow me one more thing, that's to draw your attention to the RP Hamalian Fund run by the Community Knowledge Exchange that supports marginalized groups who are mostly impacted by this pandemic. Please consider donating to this fund, and the link is posted in the chat box. It was awesome, fascinating, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm looking forward to meeting you again at the upcoming webinar. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.